So welcome to today's session. The plan for today is to actually have us maximize these 90 minutes by allowing our panelists the opportunity to cover some very key topics. We will talk about the issues, and more importantly, we will talk about some solutions. We're going to leave about 10 minutes, as I referenced a few moments ago, for some closing remarks as well as questions that you may have within the group chat. And with that, I want to thank everyone for joining the call. And this is a phenomenal program that we are looking to have some candid conversations around, and that's the issues of racism, whiteness, and privilege. I am your moderator, Dr. Tammy Smithers, and I am a visiting scholar with the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice. I'm also a visiting scholar with the Center for Minority Serving Institutions. Both are housed at the Rutgers University's Graduate School of Education. So with that, I'm going to just sort of set the stage for what's happening in this country today. In the United States, we are currently in the midst of a pandemic. We're actually in the midst of two pandemics. We've experienced in the first pandemic a global health crisis in the form of COVID-19. COVID-19 has stopped us in our tracks and has forced us to change the way in which we engage with one another and connect. Some might say that this is the first pandemic, but when in actuality, it's actually the second. Among other things COVID has done, it has unveiled the racial health disparities among Black and Brown communities. The trickle-down effect of COVID-19 also exposed the digital divide within some households, and it's also heightened awareness about food insecurity in poverty-stricken households. The pandemic of racial injustice and police brutality have been on display far more frequently within the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery on February 23rd, Breonna Taylor on March 13th, George Floyd on May 25th, Tony McDade 2 days later on May 27th, and Rashard Brooks on June 12th. Sadly, these murders are nothing new. Both of these pandemics are continuing to take the lives of men and boys, women and girls in the Black community at faster rates than in other communities. Black women have shouldered the heavy burden of watching their sons, watching their daughters being victimized, terrorized, and murdered by rogue police officers. These are people who take an oath to protect and serve and uphold the law. Black men in this country are target practice for white supremacy ideologies. The penalty for being Black in America is the source of frustrations for generations past and present who have been marginalized, criminalized, demonized, and made to endure far more pain. Implicit bias coupled with white fragility has systematically upheld policies that disproportionately impact Black Americans. So today, let us take this opportunity to discuss, share, and listen. Doing so is vital so that we can move the needle for better understanding. And with the help of white allies, accomplices, and comrades, we can begin the process of dismantling systemic racism. This means some of you must get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It also means not centering white perspectives to the degree that the Black experience is subordinated to white ethnocentrism. The request of you today is to prepare your heart and open your mind to what is going to be a much needed conversation and discussion around three critical terms that many of you have no doubt heard a lot about. And that is, again, racism, whiteness, and privilege. The three goals that we have for today is to first unpack racism and its actions and move you from a racist mindset to an anti-racist mindset. The second goal is to deconstruct privilege and what it means and how it is experienced by white conservatives and, quite frankly, white liberals in this country. The third goal is to introduce allyship as a dismantling tool for systemic racism. So now I'm going to introduce our four guests. And first we have with us Dr. Ashley Bennett, who has spent her entire career working in education, starting off in college admissions at Oklahoma City University, and later serving as Director of Admissions and Recruitment at Wiley College, which is an HBCU. In 2013, Dr. Bennett moved into the K-12 private high school, where she served as a college counselor before transitioning to her current role as Director of College Counseling at KIPP Sunnyside High School here in Houston, Texas. Next, we have with us Dr. Candace Brunner, who has been an educator for over 15 years and has served in various roles within private and public school sectors, from being Director of Development to Assistant Head of School. Currently, Dr. Brunner is an English as a second language facilitator in the Katy Independent School District here in Houston, Texas, which is where she helps students to obtain college scholarships, understand the university application process, and have equitable access to technology. Next, we have with us Aswad Walker, who is the Associate Director of Texas Southern University's Urban School and Resource Center. He is also a lecturer of African American Studies at the University of Houston. Mr. Walker is a writer and editor for the Houston Defender Network News Media, and he's an author of 3 books. And I hear someone's feedback. Can you mute the phone? I hear feedback. Thank you. Thank you very much. So Mr. Walker is a writer and editor for the Defender Network News Media and an author of 3 books, and he's a national award-winning journalist. If that is not enough, since 1990, Mr. Walker has served as the co-pastor of the Pan-African Orthodox Christian Church, also known as the Shrine of the Black Madonna. Lastly, we have Dr. Joy Ratliff, who is originally from Brookhaven, Mississippi, and is the Director of Prospective and New Student Programs at University of Houston. Having presented at over 50 conferences, Dr. Ratliff's work and research focuses on higher education disparities, college student transition, critical whiteness studies, and racial allyship. So I am very proud to introduce all of these 4 phenomenal speakers today, and each of you has just demonstrated in your own way your passions for children and youth, adults, and that's commendable. But Aswad, I wanted to really kind of highlight your track record. You've been doing this work for 30 plus years. You have a history of advocacy, which I've personally witnessed here in the Houston area. And I've known you for a very long time. So I just want to say thank you so much for what you've done and what you're continuing to do for our community. So again, welcome to all 4 of you. And I want to just share with the guests that as a precursor to our discussion today, I want to begin by allowing each of our guests to give us 60 to 90 seconds of their stance or positionality on a series of events that have happened over these past weeks or past months. And if you can just speak to one prevalent message that individuals within your circle has been expressing, that would be great. And I want to have Aswad start and just give us sort of your take on how we as a nation, how we have arrived to where we are at this juncture today. Thank you. Turn your volume up. Turn your volume. Unmute your phone.
There we go.
There you go.
There we go. So one of the ways I think we've come to this particular position that we find ourselves is because we have shown no courage in being able to sit down and confront the realities and the histories in this country of race and racism. And so that has always been foundational, behind, or in front of every single issue that we've ever had in this nation. And until we're able to seriously stand up and confront it, it's just going to continue to roll. I think at this particular point, you see this great awakening in a lot of whites to what Black and brown folk have been saying since Black and brown folk have existed in this country, that racism is prevalent, especially in the criminal justice system. And so the awakening of others to this reality that we've been screaming about, I think, is what has brought us here to this point now, where so many people are willing to give energy, time, and effort to figuring out how we can dismantle these inequities.
Okay, okay. Now I'll have Ashley. Ashley, why don't you take us into what your thoughts are next?
Similar to Aswad, I believe that, you know, we're here because we are very still right now, and we can't look away. And we are in a space where we have to confront what is happening in this nation. And my personal position is I'm a Black woman who is passionate and tenacious about the liberation of Black people. And that has always been the case. However, it has hit differently now for me as well, because I mother my 16-year-old sister. I serve as a mother figure for her. And I have a 15-month-old son. I also am wife to a large Black man who may appear to be menacing to someone who maligns him in that way. So for me, I know it can be frustrating for those of us who have been in this fight for a while. And as Aswad just said, you know, Black and brown folks have been screaming this since the beginning of us. However, I'm welcoming anyone who's ready to engage in this work. I'm welcoming you right now, wherever you are, even if you're in the infancy stage of social justice work. I'm happy you're here. And so I just think that we're here now because we need to be here now. And we should have been here 50, 60, 100 years ago.
Very good. Joey, next, how about you? What is the one pressing issue that's resonated with you?
Yeah, I totally agree with Oswald and Ashley on this kind of awakening, and this we've seen this spark, if you will, in terms of people who are finally coming to terms with the racism that has always been prevalent in this country, and they're starting to wanting to say something. A positionality of, I hope it lasts. I hope this is not just an in the moment type of performative allyship. And I've spoken out quite a bit on social media and in other channels on how this is so quickly, you know, we want things to go back to normal, but how important it is that we realize normal is not normal. That is not where we need to go back to. And so I'm all game if we want to use this as an opportunity to move into these spaces and to move into this kind of more allyship, or as Brandon so eloquently put it yesterday, this, you know, comradeship or accomplishship. But, we are at a place to where we are in jeopardy of reverting right back to the systems that have been in place that are working how they are designed, right? And they are working exactly how white people designed them to work, to benefit them. And we're needing to make sure that I am glad to see this surge of people who are speaking out against that. And I think that I just, again, reiterate, I hope it lasts. And it's on us, people who are in this space doing the activism in our own circles, both interpersonal, but also group work and dialogue. All that is really important and just vital at a time like this.
Thank you, thank you. Last but not least, Candace, give me 60 to 90 seconds of your positionality on what's happening.
So Dr. Smithers, as you know, my research area of interest is actually on gender issues and mostly women in sports. And I'll never forget the first time that a male colleague that I never expected in a million years called out a practice that had gender bias in it. And it was like this weight lifted, like, oh, look at you, you're helping me, because you feel like you're just fighting constantly, and not necessarily constantly in a negative way, but it's like you can't ever tire. You can't ever put down, that burden that you end up carrying without intention sometimes. And I know that battle fatigue is so real, and I've experienced it in my own, kind of area of research and what I'm passionate about. And with everything going on, you just think, okay, but I can be that voice, and I can join this battle and, be in it with you. Mm-hmm. And it's not, I hesitate to even say this, but sometimes I feel like it's not my fight. And I think that that's wrong, that I have to change that thinking in myself too. And so I just want to find more ways, and I want other people who maybe look like me and think like me, grew up like me, see the same thing. And maybe by hearing me talk about it, they think, oh, okay, well, I can do that. Even if I don't agree with everything I hear and say, yeah, but I can advocate in this way, and I can push for this, and I can call out things I don't agree with.
Thank you. And that leads me to my next sort of entree into why we're here. So just for the audience, I'm going to give you guys a little context around what led to this discussion outside of what we already know. But a part of that was about 3 weeks ago now, I co-wrote an article that was entitled "The Weaponry of Whiteness, Entitlement and Privilege." And that article, I got great feedback, people concerned, what can I do? And one of the messages was, people were sort of conflicted as to, when you use the term, whiteness and privilege in the same context as racism, they couldn't reconcile that. So one message in particular that I received was from a woman, and that woman was the person that you just heard from, Candace, Dr. Brunner. In her message, she basically gave her positionality, and that was this, and I'm going to read exactly what she wrote me. If you don't mind, Candace, I'm putting you on the spot
okay.
here. I am white, female, I drive a pickup truck, I own a ranch, I'm a Republican, I'm a mom, I'm an educator, and my husband is a law enforcement officer. She then went on to write, people like me feel a bit out of place in this. They see the injustice, but don't know what to say or how to understand it. They can't comprehend privilege because no one who looks like them has tried to explain very well. Perhaps they don't even know that many Black people. I think racism sounds like the KKK to a lot of white people, and that just isn't it. It is a continuum. The best thing white people can do right now is try to understand where they fall on that continuum and work to improve and to listen. Shut up, sit down, and listen, unquote. So that's the reason why we're here today, and I appreciate you for engaging me in that dialogue. We wanted to figure out how we could go take it to the next step. So this is a part of that next step. So if you're in the infancy stage of this, I commend you for joining us in this. But I want to now touch on privilege, right? White privilege. And Ashley, I want to direct this first question to you. So with that statement that I just read, that our colleague Candace wrote, and using a socio-cultural framework, how would you describe this phenomenon of white privilege?
Okay, Candace. When I direct my remarks to you, I'm really talking to white people, in particular, white women. So to me, that statement that you made to Tammy, put your privilege on full display. So I don't believe one has to use eloquent language, nor should they look like you for you to get it. So many white scholars actually have delved into the topic of white privilege and explained it quite thoroughly. I don't think it's my position to do that today, because that means unpacking years and years of work. But what I will say is it is important for white people to do their own work, to grapple with their own privilege, and to not look to people of color, specifically Black people, to do that emotional labor for you. So I'll start with that. One does not have to personally know Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, a Tatiana Jefferson, and countless other Black men and women who have been murdered at the hands of law enforcement officers. One doesn't have to know them to get it, to get that it is wrong, to get that they did not deserve to die. I do not have to look like someone to recognize their humanity. So I think we need to get away from, I need to hear it from someone who looks like me, because I am a human being. My experiences matter, and it should matter when I'm explaining that to someone, no matter their background. So I'll say that. But one thing I will agree with Dr. Brunner is racism does exist on a continuum. And this is something I talked about earlier in the week. I'm very well aware that when folks who are new to this work or new to this conversation, when they think racism, the first thing that stands out to them is overt racism, the KKK, burning crosses, lynching, those sort of things. And, you know, because we're in this post-racial society, we don't see that anymore, right? So we think we're beyond that. But racism, the continuum is from the far right extremists to the white liberals who love to tell you they voted for President Obama twice. Okay. Racism exists from the KKK to white women who exclusively sleep with Black men. They too can be racist. So I think we have to be very careful to not put racism in this neat little box. And if you don't fit in that box, you're woke and you're with it and you're anti-racist. That is not the case. We all have some unpacking to do to confront our own biases. And so for white people who are interested in this work, get out of your feelings and really listen to the voices of Black and brown people who are telling you our experiences. And to Dr. Smithers' question, white privilege is also being obtuse and disconnected from the realities of racism and police brutality that have caused countless deaths in the Black community since the diaspora. So I don't believe we can get to the meat of white privilege today, but I do believe it is really time to understand we have got to unearth America. We have got to unearth privilege and deal with it, confront it head on.
Thank you. So Candace, I want you to talk about, you can respond to Dr. Bennett, or you can, just explain to the group or the audience, what does white privilege mean to you?
Yeah, sure. So I think that the biggest thing a lot of people struggle with is they hear privilege and they think, oh, but I work hard. I don't know what you're talking about. And so this wall comes up and then they have trouble even hearing beyond that. And so I'm going to take a very simplistic explanation, and, feel free to correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I've had barriers in my life, right? I was born in poverty. That eventually changed for me. And I have various privileges in my life, right? I don't have an intellectual disability. I don't have a major health crisis. And that's a privilege that I have. And one of those privileges is my race. I'm part of the dominant race of my region, my country, my area. And so what I try to say, and again, it's an oversimplification, is white privilege doesn't mean that your life's been easy or something's been handed to you. It just means that you don't have a barrier of race in your life. And that sounds small, but when you compound that over 100 things about your day and the way you interact with someone and the way you shop and the way you buy real estate, that little barrier starts to become a really big barrier, right? But my entry level explanation to people who are trying to understand it is you have to think of it not that someone's accusing you of having an easy life, because that's the response I always hear, but that they're saying, you have to reflect on how other people have had a different experience. And so I guess, yeah, that's my little summary. And then just a comment on what I was saying about the continuum of racism. I don't think that the average white person that I know or interact with regularly sees how big that continuum is, right? All the way from, you know, clearly overt racism and white supremacist groups that are out there and still exist today. And then maybe something that's more in the middle of, you know, you don't want your, you know, children to date people in other cultures and races, all the way to something that you might think isn't racist at all. And that's writing a dress code that's not inclusive, but that's, you know, that's racist too. And so I think, you know, unpacking that for white people, not that that's anyone's job specifically, but it's something that a lot of my friends have honestly never thought about, you know, and that's a privilege too. When you grow up white, and I certainly can't speak for everyone, you know, but talking about race just is something that we don't do much of. You know, if we talk about it at all, it's very much like, oh, well, you know, your parents' generation, you know, they fought the fight, they marched, and we solved it, so we're good, you know, which obviously is, you know, not accurate. But I didn't have those kind of conversations as a kid, and so it definitely took into my adulthood to even really consider what race looks like and what it is. And of course, my full-time role right now is advocating for immigrants. And so I do it a lot. I work in it a lot now, but my average typical friend honestly doesn't, you know, not all, but a lot of them don't. And so when they even come to a conversation about race, you know, they're in algebra, and people from other races are in calculus. You know, it's a very different level. So it's really hard to even have a conversation, because what may be an academic discussion for them is very personal, you know, to other people at that table. So we need to, you know, build new tables. This is what was said yesterday. I really liked that a lot, because I think it's key to changing how successful we are.
And I'm gonna jump in there. I want Joey or Dr. Ratliff. I think we're kind of using our formal titles here in this forum, but we don't have to, by the way. But Dr. Ratliff, I want you just to sort of, you've done some work and research around the critical whiteness, and can you give us a little bit more? I mean, you can talk about your lived experience and privilege, but I also want you to kind of give us a little bit of the, I would say, academic, maybe intellectual research that you've done around white privilege or whiteness.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but I will take it from kind of the academic lens that I typically look through, which is critical whiteness theory, critical whiteness studies, really focusing on the fact that in itself is stolen and co-opted from scholars of color who started the critical race theory. And so it's almost a juxtaposition, anyone who's working with whiteness, that you're actually centering whiteness amongst topics where you don't want to center whiteness, but there's also, how do you move forward though without doing so? And so there is, I just want to put out that juxtaposition in general. The first models that we work with when we're looking at white racial identity development, the ones that we talk about from the 80s and the 90s, while there were some, you know, again, scholars of color have been talking about this since the beginning, right, of previous hundreds of years. But then when it came into one of the first ones, when it started taking on and becoming popular, was Helms racial identity development. And that's where, you know, Helms really came at it from only a black and white dichotomy. And so it was seen as fairly problematic because there were other people in the American society other than just black and white people. So then you get into Ponerato and others within allyship models, and you start looking at it from more intersectional identities and talking about how whiteness kind of infiltrates everything in that way. Let's be very clear. Whiteness, white privilege, allyship are all coded words for racism. That's it. They are simple words to make white people feel more comfortable to not use the R word. And I think that that's something really important and a privilege that we have, because a tenet of whiteness is racial comfort, right? Pay to talk about race as long as you don't accuse me of being racist, right? And that's how a lot of white people see it. So I listened to Candace, and, you know, and a lot of something that I wrote about in my dissertation was, you know, white people's role and their position within the social justice conversation. And Candace, you mentioned something, and I think it's important to point out is like, when you mentioned how it wasn't, you weren't sure like whose specific role it was or responsibility it was to talk about racism. And I think that it's really important that we all understand that from a critical whiteness lens, the word allyship indicates, and white privilege and allyship indicates that the problem of racism is on Black people. And that's not correct. And so when you say allyship, white people have to own racism because we are the perpetrators of it. We are the perpetrators of white supremacy. So I think it's really important that when we talk about all these things, that we're realizing that within these contexts, that we're talking white coded language, and when we use these words, and that we white people have to get our friends and our you know, social media acquaintances and everything, that we have to call that out at every single instance, and we have to make sure that we are correcting the behavior. And right, and I think that there is a little bit of, I think there is something to say with people who are just entering this conversation and not going full blast at them at first. But that is also whiteness and racism, and that is the comfort piece, and that is, you know, that is also harmful in many ways. And I think that especially with Tammy's article talking about white liberals and conservatives, how we can all cause harm in those ways by not being well educated, and again, not doing our own, not owning the work ourselves. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what the theories, and that's what the current literature, the white racial frames. You've all heard, Tammy, you talked about Dr. Kendi yesterday, and how to be an anti-racist. So there are great resources out there that we, as if we are going to be in this fight, which we, because it's truly should be our fight as white people, then we're ones that need to become educated and stop putting the work on our Black friends, colleagues, and neighbors.
Thank you. So I want to now, so Aswad, so you're kind of wearing a couple of different hats here, right? You are a lecturer on African American studies. Okay, so you're talking to students, but you're also pastoring a church, a Pan-African Orthodox church. So in that context, or in those contexts, how are you communicating the white privilege or the oppression of white people to the oppressed? I mean, how are you communicating that in this kind of conversation, or how would you communicate that to students and or parishioners?
Well, in terms of communicating it with my students, I can give them, book or intellectual definitions of white privilege, like white privilege is the social economic structures created and institutionalized by public policies that have enabled the uneven transfer of wealth, education, and other social benefits to whites, policies that shape the sorting of students in public school systems, educational opportunities students have access to in schools, the resources their families have to invest in education, creating intergenerational patterns of inequality, blah, 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 blah. But really, we just try to break it down to a real level. White privilege is having the ability to care about police violence or not. Having your racism, conscious or unconscious, trump what you say you believe about Christianity, what you say you believe about democracy, what you say you believe about America first patriotism, while still believing you are more Christian, more democratic, and more patriotic than Black folk. Having the audacity to question Black people's patriotism after we literally built this country, and believe in, Black folk believe in America when America has given Black people zero reasons to believe in America. White privilege is being cool with unlawful, undemocratic voter suppression, yet calling Black people who are fighting for the right to vote un-American. White privilege is being able to celebrate and consume Black culture while rejecting Black people. White privilege is shopping in a grocery store, traveling down aisle K, hearing over the intercom code Black on aisle K, and never even considering that you might be code Black on aisle K. All these things. White privilege is listening to the news and never having to go into Black mode. And all Black folk know what I'm talking about. You turn on the news and you hear about some suspect of some crime, and Black folk go into Black mode. We are praying, please let it not be a Black person, because any crime or suspected crime done or suspected to have been done by a Black person reflects on all Black people, while you can have a Dylan Roof, you can have a Harvey Weinstein, you can have a Jeffrey Dahmer do what they do, but their heinous acts are never associated with all white men. We never assume that all white men or white people are mass murderers or sexual predators or cannibals, but that is white privilege. You don't have to deal with that. White privilege is only having to give one of the talk to your children. White privilege is being considered innocent until proven guilty, being considered innocent even after being proven guilty. And so I like the way the doctor said it. It's really just real kind words to talk about racism, which is not just personal, but it's systemic, it's institutional. What I teach my class, I tell them that racism, I mean, you know, prejudice, we all have our prejudices and all that, but racism are those prejudices with the institutional power to back it up. A good friend of mine that I grew up with, going to middle school, high school, white guy, he holds a position that he doesn't comprehend white privilege because he was poor. He had issues and challenges growing up. And I understand where he's coming from, but he's never had to do, you know, like Dr. Candace said, he's never had to deal with race being that barrier to, I mean, you know, if when you have a Black person, a white person of equal credit scores go to apply for a loan, the chances of the white person getting a loan are far higher. A white high school graduate has a far higher income rate, far higher ability to get employment than a Black college graduate. A white person who is an ex-felon has better opportunities statistically than a Black person who has never seen or sniffed a jail to accessing a job or to accessing further advancement. So I try to break it down into very, very real, understandable examples so that, you know, we don't have to spend all of our time trying to talk about this, because there's so much more that we need to be talking about.
Excellent, excellent. So, and that sort of leads me into a couple of you guys mentioned this, the discussion around racism and why it's referred to systemic racism. You covered a lot of it, Aswad, just in some of the examples that you gave, but I want to just sort of reframe it from, you know, from today and yesterday, but to understand what systemic racism is and how it is viewed in this country. As Joey mentioned, I studied the work of Ibram Kendi, Professor Kendi, and I'm going to use in the discussion for today this particular definition so that we all have the same definition that we're working from. And Professor Kendi's definition of racism is the marriage of beliefs, attitudes, and actions that evolve into racist ideas, which are then merged with racist policies that produce and normalize racial inequalities. And he also states that the denial is the heartbeat of racism, beating across ideologies, races, and nations. And he further states that the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify it, describe it, and then you can dismantle it. He suggests that by calling out racial policies, it goes beyond what we define them as. And so that's what you just said, institutional racism, structural racism, and systemic racism. So all of these terms are what we hear when we talk about racism, but I'm going to just use the one term, systemic racism. And so another common phrase that Professor Kendi, or that we hear, is racial discrimination is an immediate and visible manifestation of an underlying racial policy. So to focus just on racial discrimination takes our eyes off of the central agents of racism. So when you say, and I believe Candace mentioned this, you know, there's different continuums of racism, you know, to actually say, oh, I only see racial discrimination when I see it being, you know, conducted on someone, that is really only a small sect of what racism is. You know, Kendi talks about that these central agents of racism is actual racist policy. And those racist policy makers, which is basically couched as racist power. So we're talking about a power structure, of a dominant, you know, structure of power and policies that are designed to suppress Black and brown individuals. And this essentially is what the current occupant in the White House is using to poison our society and threaten our democracy. So this is sort of the state that we're in. You know, we're kind of in this state of emergency at this moment. So when I listen to all of this scholarly work and what Aswad just articulated, and when we use the definition of racism, I'm going to pose this question again to you, Aswad. What can white allies do to begin the process to expunge or eradicate racism? Because as Joey mentioned, it is white people's job to get rid of racism. So can you give us just one thing in a few minutes of what they can do to help eradicate racism?
I'm sorry, you were asking me?
Yeah, Aswad, yes, I'm sorry.
I think do the work yourself. I have a few white allies, and what they do is they don't go around apologizing for being white. That's not what we're asking folk to do. I mean, you are how God made you. Be proud of that. They don't walk around saying I don't see color. They see color and they recognize it, and that's a good thing. Let's recognize it and respect, you know, other people's differences. But what I've seen my friends who are allies do is they walk it and talk it. They preach equality and they live equality, and they challenge anyone and everyone, family members, friends, who are standing in the way of that equality. They raise their children in homes that reek of equality. They go to events that promote this racial equality. And so they don't just talk it, they don't read it, and they don't ignore it, but they stand firmly in acting in ways that seek to bring about this kind of equal social reality that we say we want. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, so you're talking about the you know, kind of in society, family racism, attacking it from that perspective.
Yeah, because you're asking me, you're basically asking me what white folks should be doing.
Oh yeah, no, it's good. I'm going to a kind of the next point of this. So, you know, we're talking about it from that perspective. And because we do have educators on the call or on the panel, I want to hear from, I'll start with Candace on, you know, the fact that you've spent the majority of your time in K through 12. So when you worked in public sector, you're now in private, or you worked in private and now you're in public sector of school, K through 12. So can you talk to me about racism in terms of the educational system? I mean, the research has espoused that the US educational institutions were built as a result of segregationist laws. So we know the history of how institutions were in terms of educating people. This dates back to Jim Crow segregation era and all the way until the Civil Rights Act of 1965 at the end of Reconstruction. So presumably we are now in a post-Reconstruction era, but we're still seeing these disparities that I alluded to at the very beginning within the educational context. So how can the educational system aid in the elimination of systemic racism? And I'm asking Candace this question.
I mean, I think it is obviously a massive, massive topic,
Yes.
and it's not my area of expertise. So I'm going to comment on some very specific things that some of our guests that I know are on can take home tomorrow, or when if school starts, that we can do. And that's honestly a new way of thinking. If you're in a leadership role, which if you're in education, you are in a leadership role. If you sit down and make a decision about course selections or dress codes or what time the child care center closes, and you just made the decision based on your own knowledge and what the logistics of your building, and you really thought through it, and now you make a decision and you put it out there. I hesitate to say, but perhaps I shouldn't, that you've made a racist choice because you did not consider other people and the way they think and what they might need and the way that they might want to eat their meal or grow their hair or wear a headscarf, or, you know, you've now made choices that are not inclusive. And so I think the best thing that every individual leader can do, you know, not necessarily education as a whole, but on a smaller scale, is remember that you have to make inclusive decisions. And if you don't know the answer, or you don't even know the question to ask, then you need more people around your table who do, and who represent other views and other ways of thinking, you know. And honestly, that includes how you order jerseys. It just does, you know. And so I guess I would encourage, you know, my friends and colleagues and those who are very new to this, that you can start there. You know, obviously the bigger issue is that our most successful schools have systems in place, and the way we vote on city council persons or school board decisions, the people who vote and advocate continually make a lot of small choices that add together to mean white schools get whiter and whiter. And, you know, when you draw lines that aren't inclusive and that are not representative of your region and your area, you know, that totals together to make a society that lives in enclaves. I mean, you know, Houston's one of the most diverse cities in the world, but are we an integrated society? I mean, don't get me wrong, absolutely there's pockets of it, but there was a great study out of Rice a couple of years ago that said that actually we've just developed these enclaves in the way that we live. And so there are beautiful examples out there of, you know, how we can get it right. But those are things that I think, you know, we have to consider, that the absence of including diverse decisions is a racist choice.
I'm going to stop you there. So Ashley, you are working in K through 12, and you've also worked in higher education. What are some of the examples of racial and socioeconomic disparities you've witnessed in the educational system? And then you can sort of address a little bit to expound on what Candace was explaining in terms of what systemic racism looks like in education K through 12.
I'll echo Candace's sentiment that this is a really big, massive topic that would be hard to capture in a couple of moments. But I'll just say from my experience, leaders who do not look like the students they're serving. So it's important for, if we're talking about post-secondary, so it's important for president's cabinet to look at themselves and look at their students. And if they're not an accurate reflection, they cannot make decisions for those students that will serve them well. They need to bring people to the table who have the same level of power. And that's the important piece. The same level of power, the same decision-making authority. They need to bring those people to the table to advocate for students who are underserved. Even the most well-intentioned white person has racism to unpack. And so that racism can play out when it comes to policies, when it comes to, as Candace said, dress code. I have witnessed, and I have served in a capacity where I was the one Black adult in the room fighting tooth and nail for Black kids. And I'm surrounded by well-intentioned white people who are making very racist decisions. And so it is very challenging to be that one Black person, right? Because I think when we talk about diversity and inclusivity, we conflate the two. Diversity means a little bit of everyone is represented. Inclusivity means we are included. I get to make decisions. I get to pass law. I get to name policy. And so just tapping me for my opinion, that's not inclusivity. Okay, so those who are making those decisions for students, for families, they need to check themselves and look around the table. And if it is an all white table or a majority white table and that student body is not majority white, they're already starting off on the wrong foot. Other things I've witnessed, specifically with Black boys, them being punished at a disproportionate rate than their white counterparts. For teachers who don't have cultural competency training, they may view the actions of Black and brown kids as disrespectful, but it's just because they aren't connected to that cultural experience. And so teachers need to have cultural competency training that is both mandatory and ongoing, not checking the box and not saying, I did it at the beginning of the year, I'm woke. That's not how this works. This work is evolving. And so it really has to be a concerted effort on, if we're talking about the secondary level, it has to be a concerted effort on the school districts part to make sure that this conversation is ongoing. So I do have to just add, my best friend just texted me, Black girls are also punished at a disproportional rate in schools for different reasons, right? And so it's important to know that. And it's important for people to understand we aren't expecting special treatment, we're expecting equitable treatment. Not equal, equitable. Okay, our needs need to be met and our needs are different. And if we are not represented at the level of the school district administration or the college cabinet, president's cabinet, if we're not represented there, we will not be served.
Excellent. Thank you both. Thank you both. So I'm going to move us into this discussion. I think someone mentioned it a little bit, Joey, anti-racism or being anti-racist. And so I have two things here. I have racism is a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequality and are substantiated by racist ideas. We've already established that. Anti-racism is a powerful collection of anti-racist policies that lead to racial equity and are substantiated by anti-racist ideas. So I'm going to ding Candace back in, and I want you to explain to me, in your view, what it means to be non-racist versus an anti-racist. And mind you, I do have a definition of non-racist because it's actually doesn't really exist. It's
Right.
But I want to kind of hear, kind of your take on those two terms.
Well, I think that, like I was saying before, if you grow up in a pretty homogenous area and you're white and most of the people around you are white, you think, oh, well, you really don't necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about racism. So I think a lot of people who may have grown up with that life experience, not all, but many, probably would say, oh, well, non-racist, right? But actually it's sort of like saying you don't have an opinion on feminism or you don't have an opinion on, any of these issues that affect people. And that's not really a choice, right? You can't have a default of nothing. And so I think anti-racist is, I hate to say it automatically means that you have to have action associated with it, but perhaps that is what I mean, that you can't be one or the other. Either you're racist or you're anti-racist. I can't imagine how there's something in the middle. And
Right.
If you are anti-racist, you can't allow things to continue without pointing them out or changing or making personal choices that are anti-racist. It has to be actionable or you're complicit.
Okay, good, good. So Joey, I'm gonna kind of take you into this, but I want you to walk us through the transformation of someone moving the pendulum from being a racist to becoming anti-racist.
Yeah, sure. It is. I'll frame it just with how you have started with this kind of anti-racist versus passive anti-racist. Passive anti-racism is not a thing. Be passively anti-racist, which I think a lot of people would say passively and being a passively anti-racist, what they may also would say is non-racist. You're not non-racist. No white person is non-racist. And so I think it's really important to kind of understand. And once you have a working definition, and when I say you, I mean white people, once white people have a working definition of of these terms, it can kind of help solidify where they're at, and help them move forward. The first thing the only way to be anti-racist is to be actively anti-racist. That is, every moment of every day you're working, doing the cause, putting in the work. And so that's it. There is passive racism and there's active racism, right? But then when you put the anti in front of it, the passive again just still doesn't work. First, it just starts with, there's also, when we talk about anti-racism, some people may think that, and it does definitely overlap with allyship. And, there's racial allyship, but then there's very specifically white allyship, right? And so, and again, we've already kind of determined that there are some issues with the term ally and what that means. But it first starts with just a nuanced understanding of racism and white privilege and whiteness. And then once you have that nuanced understanding, you're then also having to take ownership of the fact that racism is your thing. You as white, you are perpetuating racism. The system has been built for you. You are benefiting from it. You have the power, et cetera, et cetera. It then I think you then have to go into this engagement piece. So something that Oswald and Ashley have both brought up, and even Candace mentioning the action piece of this. I talk about it all the time, and coming from this institutional context of K through 12 higher ed, but also at the individual level, optics is action. You can be performative and post, and your university can submit a diversity statement and inclusion statement on the murders and the things going on. But then if you're not holding your employees and your staff and your students accountable on the other end, and if you're not having affinity spaces and allowing people to come and talk through those things, and if you're not also having that ongoing training that Ashley was talking about, then you are just being optically pleasing to your base, and that is not anti-racism. That is just being an optical performance entity within that space. And then I think finally it's really that active coalition building. And then there are already people, I think, as Oswald has been saying, there are people in the Houston community who have been doing this work for a very long time. There is no reason for a white person to say, "Oh, I'm going to start this," or this has been happening. In the 60s, around the civil rights movement, Houston had a Black freedom movement come through the city, and so Houston has a history, and I'm sure every place has a history that really points to these kind of steps of where you have to do the understanding and the education yourself, but then when you get into it, you are really doing the work and not seeking praise or this white savior complex for it. It is just a simple day in, day out. You're committed to the work, and you're putting your money where it needs to go to support these initiatives within the community to make it more accepting and more inclusive.
So, Aswad, we have this concept of anti-racist, and I'm going to use it in the context of a person saying all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter. So when you hear someone spew all lives matter as a counter to Black Lives Matter, what would you say to that individual?
I say nothing. I move on, because they know, they know what they're doing. They know that all lives matter is just a deflection, because no one who says Black Lives Matter is saying only Black Lives Matter. But folk who say all lives matter know that what they're really saying with that is Black lives don't matter to them, and they want to be excused for their racist ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors. Because on one second they'll say all lives matter, but on the other hand, they're not standing up for the murder of Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Rekia Boyd, Sandra Bland, John Crawford III, Terrence Crutcher, Ayanna Jones, Ahmaud Arbery. Philando Castile, a licensed gun owner, pulled over by police for some minor traffic offense, did what the law required that he do and let the officer know, I'm a licensed gun carrier. I have a gun in the vehicle. Within 2 seconds, he was dead. Within 2 seconds, he was shot dead. And you did not hear one person from the NRA stand up for his rights as a gun owner, because I'm sure folk in the NRA saying all lives matter, but Philando Castile's life didn't matter to them. So it's just a deflection. So if I hear that, I just keep it moving.
Ashley, I see you shaking your head. I know you have something to say. You want to say something?
Sure.
I know.
Same, Oswald. Same. Anyone who is in my life has heard me say, I do not have time to explain the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't. I should not have to explain why my life matters, why my children's lives matter. I shouldn't have to explain that. And one cannot claim to be anti-racist without acknowledging the necessity of the phrase Black Lives Matter. All lives matter, and I would also like to add Blue Lives Matter, okay? Both of those quote unquote movements are only used as a deflection, as Oswald said, in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. And so if I say the phrase Black Lives Matter and your response is anything other than absolutely, I'm good on you.
And with that, I'm going to point to Candace. Candace, I'm going to ask you, all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter. We live in a cancel culture. There's a sense of erasure, as they both alluded to, of the Black experience. When some people hear all lives matter as a counter response to Black Lives Matter. As a consequence of those deaths that Aswad listed, those men, those women who have been killed, and the current racial climate, we now see major corporations and policymakers paying closer attention. They are kneeling. These are the policymakers wearing kente cloth, posting companies and corporations and university presidents posting these blanket messages denouncing racial injustices. I choose to call this the murders, right? These racial injustices, let's call them what they are. They are murders. They seem to now understand, they as in the dominant culture, they understand, and they have taken a public stance that Black Lives Matter, because we do see corporations stating that. But I want to know, why do you believe Black Lives Matter is hard for some individuals to fathom and resort to the counter of all lives or Blue Lives Matter?
I think you can't really have another explanation outside of that. It is a deflection. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. I think when, you see how clear and how evident the issues are, like, just take, police reform and how much it's needed, right? But if you're a police officer and you think, but I've never personally seen that, and I've never behaved that way, and I don't do those things, and you're just a beat cop, then you might think, oh my goodness. And there's a lot of violence against police too, and that's the thing that they're going to want to turn to. And I just think it's just a distraction. I mean, I think any well-trained leader, knowledgeable person involved in law enforcement, they're all in agreement almost clearly that we need major reforms in police, right? So then why do you follow up Black Lives Matter with Blue Lives Matter? They don't go together, right? They don't, and how do I explain? how do I explain it? I mean, there's not a good explanation. It's a distraction. You know, when you don't understand something, instead of just leaving it at I don't understand, right? There's this introduction of something new. But also, let's be clear, there's entire campaigns out there with the intention of creating another reality, right? It isn't as simple as the average person just goes, Black Lives Matter. No, Blue Lives Matter. I mean, there's a whole structure out there that engineers that response to, you know, as awful as that is. So there's just no excuse. I mean, I don't have to agree with everything I hear Black Lives Matter activists. I don't have to agree with everything they say. I don't have to agree with everything that's out there. But I can still say Black Lives Matter. It shouldn't be one or the other. You shouldn't have to be able to say, I agree that every single one of these is a race-based injustice. It doesn't matter if you don't believe every single one of them was or wasn't. You can still say Black Lives Matter, or at least shut up.
So, Joey, do you have anything to add there?
No, I don't think I have really anything to add other than I think it's, you know, when we come to this Black Lives Matter, I question what saying it actually does if you don't have the agreement with their movement and with that movement and with what is their purpose of saying, what their purpose of believing and implementing the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm not sure that I understand the purpose of saying Black Lives Matter if you're not going to be in agreement and stand in solidarity with those who are implementing the movement and going for it. So I think that's the only thing that I have to kind of add to this, that I will say to anyone who may be feeling as if, you know, yes, agree. Any agreement I think we can see as a positive, but also not agreeing with the movement in its entirety, I think is a bit performative. And I think that there needs to be a bit of reflection on why someone may want to say Black Lives Matter, but not believe fully in the movement, because that can also be super harmful to that community. Safe and as someone as a member of the Black Lives Movement, but then in their own circles not really support it.
Okay. So you know, I'm looking at the time here, so we have a few things I want to make sure that I touch upon. And I essentially, you know, we came here because we talked about the murders and particularly the one that I think the nation paid attention to. And it's sort of put us in this box of this Black America and white America, like we have two Americas. And that is the reality of the situation that we're in today. Ashley, you mentioned you have children. You're looking at what their futures are going to be like. And as a community, sometimes made up of these two different Americas, what message can you share in regards to the need for police reform, or, you know, police ability to basically de-escalate, you know, learn how to be retrained. We have this entire movement about defunding the police. You know, why is all that important in terms of moving us forward? You want to speak to that?
Sure, and I'll keep this short. Dylan Roof was taken to Burger King after murdering 9 people, Black people, who welcomed him in their church to pray with them. The police somehow apprehended him, fed him, and transported him to the police station safely. White men and women are captured on video cursing, threatening, wielding weapons at police, and somehow the majority of them are apprehended without incident. So that same energy, that same de-escalation training needs to be applied when Black folks are accused, okay? Accused or suspected of crime and wrongdoing. So I want to be very clear. I don't mince words on this topic. They know what they're doing. They 100% know. And when I say they, I mean the police know what they are doing, and they know who they're doing it to. And when we look at the origin of police, slave patrols, okay, they were started to make sure slaves were where they were supposed to be, to track runaway slaves down. Okay, so we're not that far from slavery, y'all. We're only 3-4 generations away. And so we're talking about a group of men and women who were founded to police Black slaves. And now those same people, or the sons and daughters and grandsons and granddaughters of those slave patrols, okay, they're on the police force, and they are murdering us en masse. And they are doing it largely without consequence.
Thank you, thank you. And so I want to move us along. It's about 3:15, and so I want to leave some time for you guys to have your last words. But I want to, we've touched on this a lot in the beginning about the allyship piece. And so, you know, Candace and Joey, obviously we know why you were brought here today, to really provide some perspective and just to listen to what was being said here. But after everything that we discussed, we could have gone on. How much do you care, right? How much do you care? And I want you to answer that question. It could be very simple, one word, because I do have a few more follow-up questions. But how much do you care? And I'll let Candace go first.
What do you mean? How much do I care?
How much do you care about the discussion we've had today, allyship? You know, what is it that you talked about action? You know, how far are you willing to go to?
I mean, I just feel obligated. I think it shouldn't be a question. I don't think we should feel that it's even something you're allowed to consider, right? If you work with children, if you work in education, and certainly myself, I work mostly with Black and brown kids. I mean, if I can't make this central to what my work is about and what my life is about and how I raise my kids, I mean, I don't think I guess I have a hard time like framing an answer. It just seems so obvious that this is a core part of who we are. You know, it's 2020. Like, what are you doing? It has to be central to what we do and how we move forward and how we treat the world around us and how we think and how we look. And I don't get it right all the time. I mean, this is, like I said, it's certainly not my scholarly area of expertise. Like I think, it is for Joey, and it hasn't always been a part of my life, but I think certainly it's just simply must be a part of how we all move forward collectively. And we have to keep talking and keep being willing to make mistakes, or even make a fool out of yourself, or say something, that's not right, or that shows your infant approach, like you were saying before, to the conversation.
Joey, what about you? What I guess, and maybe to frame it differently, what's next for you? And we've talked about, your work as an ally. So tell us what's next. Sure.
What's next is, a continuation of what I've been doing. As you said in my intro, I'm from Brookhaven, Mississippi, grew up conservative, went to college at the University of Mississippi, which, has many significant racial instances where it is just, and continues to this day. There with if you're following the news with what they want to do with statues and all this stuff, and Mississippi is going through a whole flag thing right now, that runs deep from where I'm from. And so the past 3 years, as I have studied this and really gotten into it, that my transformative moment was kind of at the University of Mississippi, and when I and moving out, I think is when I also started really reframing the values that I held so dear, to myself as a white person. I am very aware now, I wasn't always, but I'm very aware now of all the privileges that I hold that are there. And now I really am moving into a space to where what's next for me is that it's just a continuation of doing the work. And again, it is a daily thing. It's writing this article, but it's also having a huge and profound impact on my own family, on my friends, on people who may think that comments or microaggressions are safe in the space because I'm a white person, but it is calling that out every single time. It is moving into dismantling the systemic racism that we've talked with this conversation. I mean, this conversation has just been so robust, and from yesterday and today, and really inspired me in my own work. But I think that what's next for me is a realization, and for any other white person in this work that's on the call, it doesn't end. There is no finish line. There is not a pinnacle. There is not an apex. You will always, every day of your life from here on out, be working to be anti-racist. And if you're not, then you are working towards being the other. And I don't know how else to simply put it. So I think that's what's next, is that realization when you get to that point is where it consumes you. And it does, and not everyone's going to take it to the level of researching it and writing about it, but there is a daily activity, and there is a weekly activity, and there's a monthly and yearly thing that you can do in order to create a more inclusive society and get at your people and bring them along with you. Because again, I reiterate, it's important for us as white people to do this work and use our privilege in a way that, and use our privilege and use everything that we have in order to make it a more equitable, cannot stress that enough, cosign Ashley, equitable society for everyone.
So let's see, I'm looking here, and I want to make sure we get some questions here. And I'm gonna have a squad, or Ashley, if you wanna jump in and maybe give our final remarks, maybe like a elevator talk, right? What would be like a 60-second elevator talk about if you're talking to someone and you want to tell them what they can do, not do for you, but to do to work with you in this fight, i.e. an ally or an accomplice, what would be those words in a 60-second elevator conversation talk or less? So Ashley, do you want to go first, or Aswad, either one? Ashley,
Aswad first, because I'm probably just gonna what he says.
Okay, Aswad. Okay.
60 seconds.
Yeah.
I think we've got to confront two myths: the myth of Black inferiority and the myth of white superiority.
Okay.
Number one. Number two, Black folk cannot do our work and the work that white people need to do for themselves. That's been done. That was called slavery, sharecropping, convict leasing. We've got work to do. I'm extremely excited about allies. But for me, that's not where my energy is.
Mm-hmm.
My energy is in the work that Black people need to do. We've got our own issues to confront. And lastly, I would say Black people have two struggles. One is for citizenship, just securing the rights that we're supposed to have. But the second struggle is for self-determination. Whether we get those rights or not, we're still building our own institutions, controlling our own stuff. And so in terms of allyship, supporting our efforts to do that, whether it's funding, whether it's supporting verbally, or just getting out the way and letting us do what we need to do.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm sitting here reading the questions. I have one. So it looks like someone basically wanted access to the recordings to keep the conversations going. And they say that it's equally important using this to remain focused and actionable on necessary agendas. It looks like it's a question, but it really, I think it's more of a statement. Let's see here. Someone says, Slavery never ended. It was codified into federal law via the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and a 14-word exception clause. A, B, so they said Ashley came close. I'm just kind of reading here. Someone says, this is interesting, it feels like some people are using the terms police brutality and systemic racism synonymously. Are you concerned that people aren't making the connection to the bigger picture? So who wants to respond to that question? That's why you want to take it?
I'm not really understanding the question.
Okay.
But I will take this second to plug 2 books. Not my own. America's Unholy Ghosts by Joel Edward Goza, and White Rage by Dr. Carol Anderson. For folk who are interested in allyship, for folk who are interested in equality, 2 excellent books. America's Unholy Ghosts by Dr. Joel Goza, who has affiliations with St. Thomas, and
okay.
White Rage by Dr. Carol Anderson, a sister that teaches at Emory University.
I would like to add something on the ally topic, Dr. Smith, if that's okay?
Sure.
So of course, same as what I had said, but one thing I will add is it is very important to create a list of actionable steps. If you are a white person and whether or not you are just coming to this awakening or you've been trying to do the work, you have got to demonstrate action. Joey touched on performative allyship earlier, wanting to go viral and be seen on social media and post pictures with your little fist in the air and all of that. But if you aren't confronting your racist grandma because she grew up in a different time, if you aren't confronting your supervisor for clearly maligning Black and brown employees, if you aren't confronting the school system that continues to perpetuate violence against Black and brown students, you too are racist. Because I'm beyond the whole you are being complicit, you're either racist or you're not in my book. And so if your allyship is quiet, that's not being an ally. You are being a person on the sideline and you are watching Black bodies drop and you have nothing to say about it. That is racism. If you aren't leveraging your privilege and tapping into spaces where you know you have influence to affect change, you too are racist.
Excellent, excellent. So I have a question here that was probably messaged to me. They said, they're asking, how do we address the issue of when people change the narrative, the false narrative of the movement, like Candace Owens? So we have this person who is essentially being used as a mule to kind of change the narrative to the other side. So how do we address that? And does anyone want to take that?
I just have one thing to say.
Yes, ma'am.
About Candace Owens. If you watch Candace Owens and you believe that she is a representation of Black women or Black people, you are completely obtuse and missing the point of the movement. I don't even know that Candace is being used as much as she is using this platform to make money, to make a name for herself. I don't even know that she believes half of what she says. I think she has decided this is the way that she can make a name for herself, and she's doing that. And as I looked through her social media before I blocked her, I realized most of her, well, all of her amens and pats on the back and likes and retweets were from white people. I'm very cautious. If what I'm saying is bolstered by white viewers and I'm not seeing many Black and brown folks agree with me, I have to check myself. And so being palatable and being the token and being that Black person who white people defer to, that's not the point of this work. Speaking truth to power, no matter how it's received, is the point of this work.
excellent ending point. I want to thank everyone. Oh my goodness, this was a great discussion. I am just overly excited about what's next. I mean, I think taking action items, stop doing the performative work. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but if you have some energy behind it beyond that, we talked about what's 6 months from now, doing the work 6 months from now, not because it's popular today, but being able to continue the course. So I just want to say thank you to everyone. I thank you all for joining us, and we will catch you on another time, and have a great day. Thank you guys. Bye-bye.